Welcome to The World This Week here on France 24. The past 7 days digested by our special panel here with a real hunger for news. Let me say before we start that we can't discuss the French elections. There is a period of electoral purdah before voting. This is French law. So if you've tuned in for that, I'm sorry. But we've got lots of other interesting things besides. Let's introduce the panel. Patrick Smith, editor of the Africa Report. Great to see you, sir.
Greetings. Thanks.
Matthew Dalton is the Paris correspondent of the Wall Street Journal. Great to see you, sir.
Hello.
On the other side of our studio, Catherine Norris-Trent, senior reporter here at France 24. Thank you for finding time to be with us. You've been extremely busy, I know. We were meant to have Craig Capitas of the Daily Beast. Craig is slightly unwell last moment. Craig, I know you'll be watching. Get well soon, sir. We're going to start with the situation in Ukraine, day 58 of the Russian invasion. Amid the destruction of Mariupol, it's emerged there are mass graves made by the Russians. The city mayor says there are at least 20,000 dead. That figure is expected to be much higher. The steelworks in the centre of the town has been the focus this week because there are Ukrainian soldiers trapped there. They are prepared to die. Underneath the steelworks, there are Ukrainian civilians who, we imagine, hope for a better outcome. Catherine Norris-Trent, I know you've just got back from Ukraine. I know you've been to Mariupol. Can I just set you off talking about this situation? What are your feelings on it?
Well, it's an extremely tragic situation, of course. There's just huge scenes of devastation. I was there at the very beginning of this conflict in February, and the people there, what really strikes me looking at these images is that all the people I spoke to there were really unprepared for this kind of situation. A lot of them, I asked them if they had food stocks, if they're preparing for all-out assault, and virtually no one said that they were prepared for this kind of situation. And so it's very worrying. We know that some people have fled. It was a city of 450,000 before this war, and around 100,000, possibly more, are still there, and they now can't escape. So there's just these huge scenes of death and destruction. And a lot of people clearly were in denial and in disbelief that this was coming for them, even given that the hugely strategic position we can see of Mariupol there down in the far southeast of Ukraine on the Sea of Azov, and a very strategic location, because if and when Russia finally declares they've taken this city, well, they have declared it, but if that is confirmed, then it gives them this land bridge there from the Donbass, south of Ukraine, and clearly something that Vladimir Putin is very keen on having ahead of Victory Day in Russia.
Indeed, Victory Day. Catherine, thanks for the moment. Matthew, could I bring you in? This Victory Day thing, Putin needs to, in his eyes, get this all done and dusted before then so he can have something to stand up and make people cheer about.
Well, that's what Western officials and analysts are looking at and expecting. And it's going to be difficult for him to accomplish much, I think, in the Donbass, where Russia has refocused its forces. This is an area where the most experienced and toughest Ukrainian army units are focused, defending the country. The Western powers have been supplying them with plenty of weapons. The flow has not stopped, so they're going to be well equipped. These are very tough fighters, and Russia, as we've seen, has its military has not been performing well in this battle, in this war, and so to really make any kind of progress within the next week or so in terms of capturing all of Donbass, all the part of the region which they don't already control, is going to be very difficult, perhaps impossible. Whether Russia will be able to make some kind of progress to be able to declare a win by Victory Day and perhaps call the whole thing off and say that, be ready for ceasefire talks is something that remains to be seen.
Indeed. Putin to meet with Antonio Guterres next week. The Kremlin has confirmed. We've not heard from the UN whether that's going to happen or not. Kremlin says it's going to take place in Moscow. As Matthew's saying, the pressure on Putin to get this win as he sees it. And of course, the city's destroyed. As Catherine was saying, there are people who are stuck there. The whole sense of what has happened really doesn't leave any honour to be found at all, does it? It's just basically an absolute hellish situation.
It's not a war about honour for certain. It's a war of attrition and great power domination, essentially. And it's pretty miraculous what the Ukrainians have done across the country so far. I would slightly dissent from what Matt is saying about the situation so far, I mean, I think the situation in Kiev is different from the east in the sense they were operating out of Belarus. They were on territory they weren't quite certain of. Their supply lines were slightly fractured. I'm not predicting, a Russian triumphant march through the Donbass at all. But what I'm saying is it will be, I think, technically easier for them to fight in the east because the supply lines are tight up against the border. It's an area where they know they've been there already. They have their people on the ground. We saw, going back to 2014, every Ukrainian will tell you this war didn't start on the 25th of February. It started in 2014, essentially. They've been there all that time. They're well embedded. And I think the fear is it's also a very different sort of terrain from the terrain in the north around Kyiv. It's more open country. It's much more difficult to ambush the Russian troops, which the Ukrainians have done with incredible skills so far. So I think it's going to be a very tough fight. And I think maybe what you're saying about the UN meeting next week is that Putin thinks that by getting victory over Mariupol, he's got enough in his pocket then to declare a victory of a kind, then to talk to Guterres and say, right, we want to cut some deal on the humanitarian situation or something that appears to be some sort of olive branch that he can then put into a package and then say on the 9th of May, look, we've done what we said. It's an operation. We never said it was an invasion. And we've done it. And we've spoken to the UN and we're back, we're back in the international system, which of course is not true and it's not a fact on the ground. I think they're isolated now, but the fact that Guterres is going there, I guess, will be held up as, Moscow is back and it's there talking to the international system.
Indeed, I suppose it depends on, as with anything, how the story is spun by whoever's trying to tell that story. Of course, Moscow's narrative will be one thing, and obviously the real narrative will probably be quite different. Catherine, of the people that you met in your mission for us in Ukraine, I imagine you struggle to find anybody who would be content with saying, okay, let's call it a day here, let's concede that ground. I mean, they want the entirety of Ukraine back, I imagine.
Yeah, people I spoke to
Probably including Crimea.
Were pretty galvanized by the war and coming together. It was really interesting. I was in Kharkiv, which is a city, Russian-speaking city, just 40 kilometers from the Russian border there. And people who consider themselves ethnic Russians, very strong family, cultural links with Russia, were now galvanized against what Putin was doing. Very surprised that he was bombing their city in such a way. One woman we spoke to said, her father was a defender of Stalingrad, and she could not imagine that Russia would then turn Kharkiv into a city which, well, they're very scared there that it's going to go the same way as Mariupol as well. So certainly people who may have had sympathies with Russia in those cities which have been coming under attack are extremely not only shocked, but it's also galvanized them in a way against Russia. Now, that's not to say that's the situation across the whole of it. In Mariupol, we met people there who said that they were going to welcome in Russian troops, that they hoped that it would stabilize the situation. I mean, clearly that's not the way that's turned out. But people there did have mixed loyalties. Now the situation was very unclear. And in the zones that Russia has occupied, I mean, how do we know? We can't get information out of those zones. I think we should really look next week. It seems that the Russians are planning to hold some kind of fake referenda in the Kherson region, as they did in Crimea after they annexed that in 2014, to try and get some legitimacy. So clearly signaling, if they do that they want to hold on to that territory, and that the way they have in Crimea since 2014, and basically bring it under Russian control and not concede it back to Ukraine. So that's something to watch out for very closely.
Indeed. As you said, creating that land bank from the Donbass along the border of the shores of the Azov across to Crimea, the Black Sea, across there, moving across to Odessa, would really basically capture a whole swathe of Ukraine's coastline, or basically all of the coastline, and cut it off completely from any sea access, wouldn't it? Which clearly,
well, apart from the port of Odessa, which for the moment hasn't been captured, and in some ways the Russians have held back from bombing that because Odessa has a very particular cultural significance for Russian people. So reducing Odessa to ruins would be a very significant act on behalf of the Russians. They haven't done that yet. Of course, that's still a possibility.
Indeed. Catherine, thank you. Matthew, the idea that we could see Mariupol situations replicated in places like Donetsk, in places like Lugansk, Kharkiv, is that a possibility, do you think? Do you think that could be something that this war of attrition comes down to?
Well, I think so. I mean, basically, Russia already occupies Donetsk itself and the city. But there are other cities that are farther to the west within the Donbass region that are still, being held by Ukrainian forces. I guess Kramatorsk, among others, that are, where the rocket attack on the train station was earlier this month. So the front line runs right through the middle of the Donbass region, and cities like that. I think they're that kind of tactic is something that Russia has repeatedly used. Mariupol before that, in Aleppo, in Grozny. This is the kind of siege and bomb to smithereens tactic is something that, without much consideration for the civilian population, is something we've seen over and over again from the Russian forces. So I'm sure this is something that this possibility is on the mind of all the Ukrainian forces, and Western governments are certainly thinking about it as well. And I think part of the key to stopping it will be stopping the advance of Russian soldiers and the Russian forces out of the part of the Donbass that they now control, to stop that encirclement from happening. There's a lot of it's going to be. I think, as Patrick was saying, it's going to be a fierce battle on those regions and along that front line, and it's going to be a little different than what we've seen before, which is almost sort of guerrilla tactics a little bit by the Ukrainian forces, ambushing Russian convoys along the road, not fighting them sort of in a full frontal attack. This is going to be kind of a more traditional army on army battle between the two sides.
And with that in mind, the extra money that Joe Biden announced this week clearly is going to, I imagine, boost Ukrainian morale to some extent.
Well, they cannot keep fighting without the steady flow of weapons from Europe and the United States. And the United States has really been providing the lion's share of that equipment. Basically the Ukrainians have said, we are firing these weapons and using them as fast as you can supply them. And they've been continually pressing for heavier weapons, for more sophisticated equipment, and really sort of stuff that can confront the Russian heavy armor in a frontal battle that we're looking at. So without it, they can't continue fighting.
Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that, one of the worries right now is just, when that weaponry runs out, because the weaponry they're getting is Eastern Bloc weaponry, right? Which the MiGs, the T-27 tanks and all that, they're going in. There's be a question of that's coming from the neighboring Eastern Bloc states. When that runs out, they're talking about bringing Western equipment, upgraded Western equipment that the former Eastern Bloc countries that are now members of NATO have been provided with. The problem is that the Ukrainian forces aren't trained to operate that. So that's going to elongate the whole process. And I think the worry is that if this drags on a long time, particularly in the East, how long will it take to get those people in position with the training necessary to operate the Western weaponry, and how much ammunition and equipment will they get from the Eastern Bloc, the former Eastern Bloc countries?
Catherine, final word on Ukraine.
Well, it's difficult. There's a great optimism amongst Ukrainian people and Ukrainian forces, but the key is this: can the weapons get in? Can the troops get trained? Now, there are Ukrainian troops, we understand, being trained in the US and the UK, but are the numbers going to be sufficient? Are those supply routes going to come through fast enough? So there's this very brave face being put on this, as we've seen since the beginning of this war. And of course, Vladimir Putin was very surprised by the fight that the Ukrainians put up, and a lot of people around the world.
Sure. Sergei Lavrov, of course, said, sorry to interrupt, Sergei Lavrov said that, the supply routes, anything that comes through, if they know it's, military supplies, that's a legitimate target. They can bomb that. That's what they're saying, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's something we will probably see more of going forward.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you very
Question
much.
Go ahead. Question: if it comes on which side of the NATO border does that come on? Obviously,
that is a whole
if it comes
different.
on the wrong side,
Yeah.
that's a different level of conflict, right?
That's the issue. And then I suppose if that does happen, the idea of a no-fly zone, which Zelensky's been calling for since day one, that would be all of a sudden introduced.
It's a bit like Churchill just waiting for Pearl Harbor to be attacked. You figure that Zelensky must be
now
thinking,
you're saying
if
something.
they can bomb a convoy in Poland, this makes our case.
Is that what we need to wait for before something like this
Well,
happens,
if they're
do you think?
stupid enough to do it, yeah, but maybe Yeah.
And indeed, I think you've hit
That's
the nail
what
on
would
the
happen.
head. It's
And I think
that kind of thing, isn't it?
they must know the risks pretty clearly.
Let's move on. So that's Ukraine. We continue, of course, to bring you all developments on that as we can. Let's turn to Mali now. Russian influence, propaganda, lies, you name it. A tweet purporting to show dead bodies left behind as France handed back a key military base in the north. The scenes were claimed to be in Gossi. France has, in reply, released drone footage filmed on Thursday that shows white soldiers covering dead bodies in the sand. Mercenaries from the Russian firm Wagner, now hired, of course, by Mali at a cost of $10 million a month. A figure that I read in the Africa report, Patrick Smith, of course, is the man behind that. The cost to the people of Mali, though, Patrick, I think it goes beyond the financial, doesn't it, all this one?
Yes, it's morphed very quickly into a kind of geopolitics writ small in Mali, and it's coming out in the resentment of Malians against the historic role of France in their country. And in walks Russia and its cyber warriors to exploit that. So, don't want to conflate two things, but I mean, there has been a battle for control of the Sahel over the past decade or more, with the jihadi forces coalescing and splitting, coalescing again, pushing back the Mali government troops. And you've had this sort of growth of these local militias trying to protect territory. And you've got the sort of makings of a civil war within Mali. And now what you have, and the French intervention helped, but it didn't solve the problem by any means. And it didn't do what people had hoped, which was to open up the space for a political solution to this. That is some sort of coming together of the people that were supporting the jihadis with government officials and trying to say, look, there's a point in extending the writ of the government in Bamako across the whole country, providing with goods and services and countering the jihadi push. That was never done. So we've had this open war, and then the junta in Bamako push out the French, and the French leave, and now in come Wagner with a kind of pretty much a scorched earth policy, and you're beginning to see this horrendous things are happening in the center of the country, pretty widespread massacres of villagers deemed to be assisting or complicit in the jihad insurgency. And it's now emerged that several operatives from Wagner have been engaged in that strategy. So the Russians are now pushing back with their own
Would that be
propaganda
specifically,
campaign.
Patrick, sorry to stop you, the massacre in Mura? 300 villagers
Yes,
killed there? They described it as an anti-jihadist operation.
Yes,
Eyewitnesses said it was a slaughter.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, then there's a UN investigation which has now been blocked by the local military authorities. So it's feeling that, I mean, that's a UN investigation. It's not a bunch of journalists. It's a full-on UN investigation trying to get the facts independently about this. And for them to block that, I mean, the assumption is that they have a reason to block it, which is to conceal what's been going on. And then at the same time, you've had the sort of information war going on, backed by Moscow. I have to say that the Moscow information war has been incredibly successful in the region,
As it has everywhere else, it seems. It's one of these things, isn't it?
well, yeah, certainly on the ground. Yeah,
Definitely.
in Mali.
I can cite people at African football matches wearing Russia T-shirts.
Yeah,
I mean, when football crowds are wearing Russia T-shirts, I think that's a sign that something is being
it's a
said somewhere
low-rent campaign,
that's getting
but
through.
it's incredibly effective.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Patrick, thanks for now. Matthew, could I bring you on this issue about the amount of money that's being spent? 10 million a month in a country where most people live on considerably less. It strikes me as a layman as really bad economics. But clearly the economics of a military junta are different things.
Well, the amount of money that they're spending has led France to cut a bunch of its aid to Mali and the international community to do the same, because they don't want their humanitarian aid which goes to the general government, to be used to pay Wagner. And the argument from the junta that they need some kind of security force to stabilize the country and fight jihadists, on its face doesn't make a lot of sense, because they are getting free support, or were getting free support from the French military, thousands of French soldiers based in the country, along with European soldiers from other countries, along with the United Nations Security Force, MINUSMA, that is based in Mali. They had all this for free. Now their ostensible argument is, well, we need to bring in this private security force and pay a huge amount of money, Mali being one of the poorest countries on earth, for this protection is absurd.
Indeed. And Mali's saying that France left them in the lurch, basically. They walked out and left them. But of course, the truth of the matter was that France couldn't work with the junta because it's not democratic, and they were actually told to leave.
Yeah, the junta didn't want them there, and also they can't. This is the second coup in 2 years, basically, and so France decided, well, we can't be supporting this and can't work on counterterrorism operations if the government doesn't want us there. So they left, and I think it's pretty clear that the junta is hired this force to keep themselves in power and to prevent another coup from getting rid of them, the third coup in 3 years. So they're resisting the Western, call from also West African countries, all of their neighbors, and the United Nations and the Western donor countries to hold elections. They were supposed to hold elections in February, and obviously that didn't happen. So this situation, that was one of the things that France found untenable, that this was clearly just a play and a ploy to keep themselves in power, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Indeed, and it leaves ECOWAS, the regional body, in a difficult situation because clearly they can't work with Mali under the current circumstances. Russia getting a bigger influence. Catherine, can I bring you in here and talk about the reporting of all this? Because clearly we as a group, France Media Monde, France 24, RFI, having problems with getting into Mali and telling the true story.
Yeah, we didn't have accreditation there anymore. That was also taken away. So it's very difficult to get information on the ground. And what I think is really interesting as well, I mean, this is clearly an information war here and disinformation, classic Russian tactics. And the French military has countered this by releasing this aerial footage they've got and kind of therefore exposing some of the techniques they use. They've got night surveillance photos as well. So they're putting that out there in a way that they would not normally do. And showing the whole process of this being set up and then filmed by these operatives on the ground in Mali, and trying to expose it in any way they can, the setup here, and just clearly both sides there of this information war, because it's so difficult and dangerous for journalists to get in there, almost impossible to go and film these scenes themselves. So the control over the information, the use of Twitter accounts, which it looks like have been set up by the Russians or by Wagner to spread this information. It's an extremely complex war. And we've seen this, it's classic Russian tactics, this hybrid war of having not only operatives on the ground belonging to Wagner, this private military company, these mercenaries to give the Russian state some kind of plausible deniability, if that still exists, but then also countering that very effectively with this information war, online tactics as well. This is what we're seeing playing out here in Mali.
Indeed, comments after our reports online making allusions to the fact that this isn't the truth. What the Russians are saying is true. One wonders where they're coming from.
It's got traction. It's got traction.
Completely.
A lot of people there don't want to listen to traditional media or French media or public media. So there's a very big market and very big appetite for this disinformation as well.
Patrick, that idea, this cyber war, this war in parallel that's been going on, and some would say it's been going on throughout Vladimir Putin's time in power, this idea of trying to completely twist and manipulate the reality.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, the KGB turned into the FSB, but it kept the credo and moved far quicker than a lot of people in the West understood from the analog age to the digital age. I mean, they were ahead. And it just bears repeating that a lot of this stuff comes out on Western-owned social media platforms, such as Twitter and such as Facebook. Facebook, for most people in that region, is the way you get on the internet. You have these Chinese smartphones, they're called semi-smartphones because they're not the full McCoy, but they're enough to get you on the internet through a Facebook application. And the first thing you see is atrocities by, European soldiers, whatever. So that is what's hitting them, and it's on a Western platform. So the average person reads that and says, well, this is it's an allegation against the Western forces, but it's actually on a Western platform. So there must be something in it. And so it's very smart. You're kind of it's a jiu-jitsu operation. You're using the giant leviathan of Western cyber information warfare against it, turning on its and right, the French fight back with this footage. I guess is the start of Western intelligence agencies wising up to what they need to do to really counter this. At local level, because that's really where it counts.
This is phenomenal. It kind of makes Machiavelli look like he's naive, doesn't it?
He needs an update. He needs an upgrade.
Please, Matthew, please go. Come on.
No, it reminds of a little, the fact that the French are disclosing intelligence about what they see really going on in Mali reminds of what the Biden administration did before the invasion of Ukraine. They really disclosed a lot of what they knew about Russia planning to invade and warning that Russia could be planning a false flag operation to provide an excuse to invade Ukraine. And that was a kind of unprecedented disclosure of intelligence that normally is very closely held and not disclosed. And I think they were very cognizant of the fact that that kind of information, is at play in the battle for public opinion and on what exactly is going on in Ukraine and what exactly is going on in Mali.
I was going to say, Patrick, I was going to ask you about the issue of Russia's involvement in Africa already, because clearly the Central African Republic, I mean, we've reported on this, haven't we, already?
Right.
I'm sure. I think you have, actually.
Yeah.
And I'd ask you the same question, so please feel free to chip in. This Russian influence growing at this extent, more countries, more involvement,
it is
more
residual.
threats?
I mean, I think, you look at the vote in the UN General Assemblies, 28 countries voted to condemn the invasion of Ukraine against the rest who either abstained, I think about 22 abstained, and then some just conveniently were busy that day. And then Eritrea voted in favor of Russia. So, they had a pretty good showing, and that was a high watermark. That's gone down. I mean, Russia, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana all voted to condemn the invasion, but then they didn't vote to push Russia off the Human Rights Council. So Russia would see themselves as gaining ground in the war for UN votes. So I think one shouldn't underestimate it. But in terms of hard power, I think the countries to watch are Centrafrique, Sudan, very important. Russia is negotiating with the junta there. It's a classic operation. They've been there. They were there under the Islamist regime under Bashir. They've stayed there. They were advising Bashir what he needed to do to repress the pro-democracy struggle. He didn't listen to them. So they're now saying, hey, if you listen to us, you'd still be in power. And now the generals are listening to them and about to give them a port on the Red Sea. So I think that's very, very significant.
That line, about to give them a port on the Red Sea. This is it's crazy to think that sort of territory can be bought and bartered in that way.
Well, Sudan is in a very, very difficult situation. It's desperate for wheat. The price of bread is going through the roof there. The junta is it's on a knife edge at the moment. It was already politically despised because of its repression, and now if they can't even provide basic foodstuffs such as bread to the people. I mean, I think they're looking at a sort of 2 years after the revolution that ousted Bashir, they're looking at another mass uprising, I think. I mean, the way things are going. And the only way they're going to get that is by some sort of deal with Russia on wheat and grain.
Indeed. And of course, as Ukraine continues, Catherine, that supply of wheat, grain, that sort of essential supply chain is being broken down. Africa is suffering completely. And one wonders where that stopgap is going to be met, how it's going to come
It's
from.
only going to get worse from here. Ukrainian farmers have only sown around 30% of the seeds that they would usually be doing at this time, and there are huge difficulties, of course, for the farmers there. Some of them, their territory is in a war zone. Some of it's mined. Some of them they can't get to parts of their land. There's huge difficulties as well processing and exporting all the grain. Of course, Mariupol was a big port. There are massive logistical problems. So this situation, it's only the beginning of the difficulties in the food chain that the conflict in Ukraine is going to spark.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Let's move on to our next topic. We're getting right back where it all started. China once more the focus of the COVID pandemic crisis. A fifth week of lockdown in Shanghai as the coronavirus takes hold there once again. Infected people, close contacts being moved to central quarantine. All this, of course, threatens the Chinese health system and brings the pandemic full circle back to China. It all began, of course, in Wuhan in November 2019. The question is, do we really know the truth about the origins of COVID-19? French research says there was actually evidence that COVID was in France around the same time that it was in Wuhan. I don't know, Matthew, where we begin to unpick this one, but clearly the situation in China, incredibly serious right now. And the whole Chinese health structure is under great threat because of what is happening?
Well, they seem to be succeeding with their zero COVID policy to some extent last year, though it did produce some, pretty broad lockdowns of, large cities. But then Omicron came, and Omicron is so easily and highly contagious that it seems to render a zero COVID policy completely untenable unless you're prepared to kind of do what China is doing, over the long haul, which is lock down entire cities, confine people to, anybody who's even mildly, even not non-symptomatic, to quarantine centers in a way that is shutting down the local economy and putting great strain on the global economy, because Shanghai is one of the most important ports in the world. It's sort of one of China's gateways to the rest of the world, and where many manufactured goods are shipped all to the West. And so this strategy of zero COVID in the era of Omicron, it seems to be completely impossible. And it's worth pointing out that even a vaccination strategy, the vaccination rate in Shanghai is somewhat lower than in the rest of China. But even if you get 90% of people vaccinated, what we know is that even the most effective vaccines are not very good at preventing infection with Omicron. What they are good at is preventing serious versions of the disease, hospitalization, and death. So if your goal is to stamp out all infections, you can't do it with a vaccine against Omicron. You need lockdowns, really severe lockdowns, isolation. So it's unclear where this strategy leads China. I mean, what is the future? It seems completely ridiculous at this point. But the government seems to be standing firm and is not releasing these measures, not relaxing anything.
Indeed, Catherine, the methods that China is employing, as Matthew was saying, incredibly strict, incredibly harsh in some ways, one might say. Are we seeing any real pattern developing from what happened the first time round? First time round, I recall people being sort of sealed into their apartments and basically told good luck,
Well, from some of the witness accounts coming out of Shanghai, that seems to very much be the case, that people are stuck inside their apartments. Sometimes they can go to the gates of their complexes, sometimes they can't, and people not getting enough food. There's lots of accounts. And as Matthew said, people being shipped away to these quarantine centres with no notice, very difficult conditions being reported there, no showers, not enough toilets, very, very difficult, draconian conditions indeed. And obviously, China being the police state that it is, there's not any mass rebellion at this stage, but there is discontent growing. People are becoming very tired of living under such conditions for so long. And the question is, how long can this be carried out to try and have some kind of zero COVID policy with Omicron being as infectious as it is and not being prevented by vaccines? So there has been some signs of resistance to people being bused to mass testing sites. There is discontent building. What form that will take, whether that will go anywhere, is another question. But clearly this is not very tenable long term, even in China. And there would be no question of transposing this model to European societies, which are very tired of COVID restrictions at this stage.
Indeed. The virus is still out there, I should say, at this point. Infection rates are growing. People are still dying too, Patrick, aren't they? This is one of the things, because I think here in the West, certainly in France, more so perhaps in places like the UK, I think people have become quite almost complacent about COVID-19.
Complacent, I think, sums it up. I mean, the caseload is as high as ever. I left London earlier in the week, and it's as high as it was at the peak. It's just that people are not getting sick in such great numbers, but there have been press disclosures of hospital plans, should it get out of control again. So it's by no means over. Just one thing I would want to say about the China situation is the social effects of what's happening in Shanghai and Beijing. I've been reading a bunch of reports about how divisive that's proving in Chinese society. It has been a mess in Shanghai, but a Chinese friend who actually comes from Wuhan and said it was pretty awful at Wuhan at the beginning of the pandemic, but they quickly realized this was an emergency. We're shutting down a city of 11 million people. So we have to do stuff. In Shanghai, it was very episodic and sporadic. There were no proper provisions. They were just saying, you're forbidden to leave your apartment. Whether you're forbidden to talk to your neighbors. You just stay in your apartment until we announce on the internet you're free to go. So there's a resentment about that, but there's also a resentment in the rest of China that somehow Beijing and Shanghai seem to be getting more attention and are the sort of privileged centers. So you're getting this sort of, as we see all over Europe, the metropolitan elites of Shanghai and Beijing are getting better treatment than the rest of the country. And that seems to be one of the things that's going around Chinese social media. I mean, they're not using it politically against the Communist Party government or Xi Jinping personally, but it's a part of a sort of social resentment about the way the government's handling. And I think if the zero COVID policy starts falling apart, or they push back very hard in the wake of a mass Omicron outbreak, you could see some real social discontent coming out of this, saying, "Oh, why are we getting treated like that? The Communist Party elite in Beijing is fine. Well, why are we getting this?" So I think there's lots of social problems could come up as a result of this.
Okay, you mentioned elites. Let's move on to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, yes, Prime Minister of the UK. He says he'll still be the Prime Minister come October. He said this on his tour to India. This, of course, after his own party turned against him as he was referred to the Commons Privileges Committee. This is an investigation over what is known as Partygate. Johnson becoming the first ever UK Prime Minister to be fined for a criminal offence, namely being at a party in June 2020 while the rest of the people of the United Kingdom were under strict lockdown. And of course, stories have emerged about how ordinary people were prevented from being with sick and even dying relatives as Johnson and his cronies celebrated his birthday. Patrick, Matthew, Catherine, over to you. I could list so many things where Boris Johnson has either been lying or twisting the truth, or I mean, going back to sort of things he said about the Hillsborough disaster in 1989 when football fans died. He said, the people of Liverpool just basically feel sorry for themselves and they should really grow up. Things he said about someone from Liverpool, again, because I was reporting that at the time, who was beheaded by Al-Qaeda. He said, well, why does he get a minute's silence? He's not a soldier. What's the point of that? That kind of thing. There are so many things. So I'm going to stop, let you guys talk about Boris Johnson. My premise is, how does this man survive ever? How has he made a career? How did he recover from being sacked by the Times as a reporter because he was inventing quotes? How is he in this position today? Patrick, can I just set you loose on that one?
Right. Well, I'll try and, look at it, in terms of the political balance of power in it.
Thank you.
And the reason is very simple. It's the constituency he's dealing with is the membership of the Conservative Party. It's not the likes of us. It's not the likes of the great British people, far less the supporters of the Labour Party, who kind of actually might find him quite useful in the hope that, that he can damage the Tories in the longer run. But what's keeping him there are the Tory shires. They love him. He's delivered Brexit. He's concocted this asylum policy, sending asylum seekers, he claims, to Rwanda. He's going to get tough with people coming across the English Channel in boats. All of that is red meat. Every time he's in trouble, what do? They back down, they attack the Archbishop of Canterbury. So always a good Tory target, these the man turbulent priests.
It was Welby who described, Justin Welby, who described the Rwanda policy as ungodly.
Against the judgment of God.
Yeah.
So he attacks that. You'll attack the BBC. They've already said that, the BBC license fee should be up for debate. So when in a tight corner, just attack. And that's what his constituency likes. I think that the one thing that will change the minds of their constituency and the fortunes of Boris Johnson will be if they've got proof positive that he is an electoral liability. We're going to see that next month, whether he is or not. We're going to see local elections. And if the Conservative Party get trashed in those elections, seriously trashed, then I think you'll start to see sentiment within the party move against him. And then you'll start to see the MPs move against him.
Catherine is brimming to get in. I'm going to keep you on pause. I'm going to keep you on pause for a second and bring in Matthew. Have you ever seen anything like it in your life? Don't say he's like Donald Trump. There's a big difference, isn't there, surely?
Yeah, there's a big difference.
Sure.
he's more Boris Johnson is better spoken, I would say, than Donald Trump.
Okay.
But many ideological similarities, many differences as well, I think. But this is. It is interesting. I do kind of compare it to the American situation where Trump has his base and that base is rock solid. He once said that he could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for him. And I think there's definitely a big chunk of his base where that might actually be true. And so you're looking at a situation in the UK where Boris Johnson has his base. He delivered Brexit, as Patrick said. He's very anti-immigration. That's something that they really like. And so the question is, does this scandal penetrate? Does it shake the base? Because obviously I think that people on the left, they already have they don't like him. People in the Senate, maybe some swing voters, this is causing them to think as well. But I think what you saw, with this investigation is the Tory party having their doubts about whether to stand by this guy. So they allowed this investigation to go through. They didn't block it. And so that clearly says to me that, that the party is, and the Conservatives are trying to figure out whether he is a liability in the end. And whether this scandal is breaking through really to the broader public.
Indeed. So, like, if Trump can go down Fifth Avenue, shoot somebody and get away with it, Boris could fall out of a boozer in Oxfordshire and knock someone down and
That would make him more popular.
Shrugs it all off. Well, this is the thing, isn't it, Catherine?
Because he's seen as this guy who's a bit funny, a bit comic, and he's got this persona which he's carefully honed, by the way, over the years.
Completely.
I remember interviewing once in London, and he was actually quite well coiffed before the cameras were turning, and then he said, "Hold on a minute," and he ruffled his hair deliberately in order. He has this persona that he creates, and it works, and it does work. He cuts through like very few politicians can do in the UK. Having said that, the British people have this sense of fair play and abiding by the rules, and it is annoying even some of those conservative grassroots voters. A lot of people suffered with the UK's very strict COVID rules, and there's all these stories of people going to funerals where they couldn't mourn their loved ones, they couldn't be with loved ones as they were dying. So this is hurting them, and I think the Conservative Party are going to get more and more wary about Boris Johnson's electoral power as this goes on, because so far he's had one fine, but there are probably more coming, because he got a fine for this birthday party which lasted apparently 9 minutes, and they sang happy birthday and had some cake, and a lot of people are like, well, that's okay. But then there are other things that are coming forward. Bring your own booze parties in the garden where suitcases full of wine were brought in, possibly even parties up in the flat of his private residence. And I think that will be a lot less acceptable. So the question is, will he get more fines? How many more fines? And this is going to start to wear some of his conservative
You mentioned the flat,
down.
Catherine, and I'm sorry to cut in. You mentioned the flat, of course. There's a big scandal about who decorated the flat, isn't there? It's yet another aspect of the Boris Johnson
and that
sort of...
he managed to brush off, but it has eroded this image of this funny, this nice guy who's you can have a chat with. It has been chipped away, and I think at some point it will stop being so funny to quite a lot of people, and it will kind of be cumulative.
There is a category difference in there, and I think you put your finger on it. It's people buy the lies are built into the electoral offer, whether it's Trump or Johnson. Everyone knows that they're both very free with the truth and the facts. But what has really got people about the Partygate is just you think we're fools. There's one law for you. You make the rules, and you choose whether or not to obey them. And we have to. And that is really, I think, the power of this scandal. And when the rest of the world says, "Well, what's all this fuss about a party in Downing Street?" That's what it's about, really. It's about the double standards at the heart of it. And I think that cuts right even into sort of the Tory heartlands. There's anger about that.
And the fact that the whip, let me explain it to people who don't know. The whip, basically someone is called the chief whip. They order the MPs to get in and vote, or they'll lose whatever they'll lose. And they basically literally go and vote this way. That's what they say to them. But the Conservatives decided to remove the whip from the party, so it was a free vote. And I think that must be indicative of how the party feels about Boris Johnson. Do you think, Matthew? You wouldn't imagine the Republicans doing that with Trump, would you?
Well,
or whoever they pick as their next.
There have
Champion.
been moments where the party has gone against Trump. They've been fairly rare, pretty few and far between, but it has happened. Yeah, I think this is how politics work. You have your coalition, and then something happens, and it's some kind of shock to the system, and it's unclear whether the leader of your party can still hold it together. And I think and then I think what the Tory base is going to be looking at, and the Tory heartland, is whether, okay, maybe even if he holds the base, can he, the people in the middle who tend to decide elections, can he hold them, or are those people going to turn against the Tories? And that, I think, is going to be the key question.
Indeed. Catherine, I'm bringing you back in because people don't know this, but Catherine and I are from more or less the same part of the world, the northwest of England, which went. Well, there's a strong sort of red wall across there, which all went completely blue for the Conservatives.
Which would have been totally unthinkable back in the day.
Certainly back in my day.
Including back in my day as well.
Indeed. I mean, are you sensing, from people you talk to back home, or whether you've been back home, I don't know, but are you sensing that things are starting to change?
People are fed up, yeah, definitely. They think that this is not fair, and that there is one rule, Patrick was saying, for the rulers and another rule for them, and they had to live through it, so why should he? So this is starting to chip away. Also, the fact that to win all these red wall seats there up in the north of England, he had to promise a great deal of things, and is this great agenda of levelling up. And unless that becomes concrete soon, then people are going to get fed up with it.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. We've run over time. I'm going to get into big trouble, but we're discussing interesting things. Catherine, Patrick, Matthew, thank you all very much. Thank you for watching too, wherever you are. Stay with us for more here in France 24.